You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up. Will the government change their minds and impose a windfall tax on oil and gas companies?
What I want to see is significant investment back into the UK. If that doesn't happen, then, as I've said, no option is off the table.
Wildfires hit the mansions of Southern California, with climate change getting the blame. And the battle to protect the mangroves in Puerto Rico. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. And tonight we start with what's beginning to look like a potential U-turn from the government. With the government under enormous pressure to deal with the rising cost of living, both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have today refused to rule out a windfall tax on oil and gas company profits. Here's Rishi Sunak this morning.
So I'm not naturally attracted to the idea of windfall taxes in general. I find that people fall into two camps often on windfall taxes. There are a group of people who think you could never have a windfall tax, and then there's another group of people who think they're a very easy answer to every problem. Now, I'm not in either of those camps. I'm pragmatic about it. What I do know is that these companies are making very significant profits right now because of the unique prices that we're seeing. What I want to see is significant investment back into the UK, into the economy, for jobs and energy security, and I want to see that soon. If that doesn't happen, then, as I've said, no option is off the table.
Well, let's take a look at how much money the UK oil and gas companies have made. Well, Shell have made £7 billion in the first 3 months of this year, while BP reported a decade high of £5 billion. Now, both have pledged to invest in green energy technology in the UK. Shell plans to invest between £20 and £25 billion in the UK energy system over the next decade, and more than 75% of that in low-carbon energy, with the rest going into UK gas and oil supplies, including in the North Sea. And BP has said it will invest £18 billion in Britain, in the great majority in offshore wind, solar, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and, of course, electric vehicle charging. Well, Sky's business correspondent Helen Ann Smith was speaking to the Chancellor this morning in Stoke-on-Trent.
What we heard from the Chancellor today on windfall taxes was really some of the softer language we've heard from him on the record on the subject. You might be wondering why I'm surrounded by plates and what this has got to do with windfall taxes. I'm at Royal Stafford. It's a pottery and ceramics factory in Stoke-on-Trent. It, crucially, is a very high energy-intensive business, uses a huge amount of energy. This company alone is renegotiating its energy contract at the moment, and their energy bills could potentially go up as much as 400 or even 600%. So how do we answer some of these questions of huge energy prices for businesses and for individuals as well? Well, one of the options on the table that Labour in particular have been proposing is the windfall tax, to tax the very specific excessive profits that have been made recently from BP and Shell and other such companies have made a lot of money out of these high energy prices. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister certainly, up until now, have been resisting it. And the reason, they say, is they don't want to deter investment into the UK, particularly green investment, if they were to put these taxes on. However, the language from some of the oil and gas companies has softened a little on that. Bernard Looney last week indicated that he would certainly retain to some of the commitments he's already made, but perhaps was a little softer in his language on whether he would withdraw other investment commitments as well. So perhaps in that context, the Chancellor feels that it will be easier for him to act, if you like. The other reason, perhaps, is that pressure on him really growing. The cost of living crisis getting excessively worse. Forecast from the Bank of England last week that the economy will contract, that there could be a recession, that inflation is going to exceed 10%. Really a sense that the Prime Minister wants to do more as well. It may get to a stage where the Chancellor cannot resist big action like this anymore, and a windfall tax, certainly an option on the table, and one he's speaking softer about now.
Now, for some of the day's other climate news now, because new research has found extreme weather could help replenish shorelines eroded by rising sea levels caused by climate change. Now, academics from Australia, the US, the UK also found large waves can drag sand from beaches and it dumps it along the surrounding coastline. And global warming is also expected to increase wave heights during extreme weather events, along with almost 3/5 of the world's coastline by the end of the century. But new findings could potentially change long-term predictions about the future of our coastlines. A record-breaking number of companies across 70 countries have set emission reduction targets, according to a climate think tank. The report from the Science-Based Targets Initiative says more than 2,000 firms have joined the initiative, but the report says there's still work to be done, highlighting that companies in Asia, Africa and Latin America are lagging behind Europe, the US and Japan. Octopus Energy Group has announced a new partnership with aims to deliver wind and solar energy from Morocco to the UK by 2027. X-Links plans to lay the world's largest subsea cables to connect a huge renewable energy farm in the Moroccan desert with Devon. Now, the project is expected to improve UK energy security and deliver reliable, clean power for an average of 20 hours a day. That's enough energy to power about 7 million heat pumps all year round. Now, wildfires continue to wreak havoc in the United States as the country's largest in New Mexico forced evacuations from a mountain resort, and flames also whipped through a coastal area in Southern California, destroying several homes. Now, the area was extremely dry and flammable but hadn't burnt for years, but the local police chief put the blame squarely on climate change.
The winds we experienced today are not unusual. These were not Santa Ana winds. These are our coastal winds that we experience generally every day. The big difference is, and we're seeing it again, with the climate change, the fuels beds in this county, throughout Southern California, throughout the West, are so dry that fire like this is going to be more commonplace.
NBC's Steve Patterson reports now from Laguna Niguel in Southern California.
As the sun is coming up now here in Orange County, this appears to be what amounts to a hotspot operation. Firefighters going from home to home in this multi-million-dollar neighborhood to make sure that all the smoldering and the hotspots are contained. The fire, though, was absolutely devastating. You can see the home behind me. This is one of several in this neighborhood, a neighborhood of multi-million-dollar ruins. I'm seeing maybe every fifth home on this block in my eyesight has been completely reduced to rubble. It is extreme, the nature and the intensity and the speed of this fire. Firefighters say, as of about 5 o'clock last night, this fire was maybe 3 acres, maybe it was 5 acres. Then firefighters watched it jump 5 acres by 5 acres until it was about 40 acres, and then leaping to hundreds of acres. The fire racing up bone-dry, heavy vegetation on the side of a canyon here. The fire cresting over that canyon, leaping with embers onto rooftops in this neighborhood, and then those embers leap from roof to roof to roof as wind gusts of about 30 miles per hour, driven by these coastal ocean winds, leapt from house to house, really destroying at least 20 homes in this neighborhood alone. Firefighters working on containment now, but it is clear, as it is only May, extremely early for this time of year here in California, that climate change is driving a lot of this, especially how dry the vegetation is, exacerbating that mega drought that this state has been in for so long, the state in a water crisis, only further making fire conditions worse. And when you have a situation like that, with the superheated temperatures that will come later in the summer, California residents are already bracing for what could come and what has already happened. We've seen here, very unusual, very bizarre for a fire this small to move this fast, this early in the season. Firefighters working on cleanup, working to get people back to see their homes. But for now, it's an operation to try to keep people away from this area as they work on the rest of the hotspots here.
Now, mangroves are a powerful natural solution to climate change. The trees, which grow along coastal wetlands, are not only a huge carbon store counteracting emissions, they also protect vulnerable communities from storm surges. But as we'll hear, some residents of Puerto Rico are battling to save some mangroves which are at risk from urban development, which is against the law. Take a look.
Este mangle, este árbol específicamente es centenario y en este espacio, irónicamente, están proponiendo, ¿verdad? Y el gobierno dando permisos para construir 7 edificios, aproximadamente 200 a 300 unidades de vivienda.
Bueno, usted sabe que el mangle es lo que es la primera pared que no para la ola que viene, para cuando vienen las marejadas, para cuando vienen los huracanes. El manglar es como la persona que se detiene ahí aguantando todo lo que puede venir hacia la comunidad, ¿verdad? No, es como una pared ahí salvándonos, porque es realmente lo que hace el mangle, es salvar a la comunidad a que pertenece.
And a bit of slightly unexpected news. Despite global warming and some ice shelves in eastern Antarctic have grown over the last 20 years. Now, this is research published in the journal Nature Geoscience, and it's suggesting that the growth was produced by changes in wind direction, which pushed sea ice up against the shelves. Now, the ice shelves were found to have grown between 2003 and 2019, but since then, an increasing number of icebergs have broken away from the eastern Antarctic peninsula. Well, do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by Dr. Shihu, who works with Oxford's Environmental Change Institute, and Richard Black, an honorary fellow with the Grantham Institute. And we'll be asking how oil and gas companies can be persuaded to reduce emissions. See you soon.
So Jim travels quite frequently on sort of geology and archaeology interest trips with other hobbyists, and travelled to Iraq with an organised tour group around a variety of historical sites and mosques and things, as well as sort of desert ruins and things in Iraq. And on visiting a site called Eridu, found some pieces of broken stone and shards of broken pottery on the ground, and kind of asked whether it would be all right if he takes a few home to stick on the bookshelf at home as souvenirs of the trip. He was told that would be fine because they have no historical or economic value. That was confirmed by the sort of experienced tour group that he was with, and also by Iraqi Ministry of Tourism official and a former police officer who was with them as security. And then upon arriving at the airport, Jim was arrested and charged with attempting to smuggle historical artifacts out of the country. And that was 8 weeks ago. He's still in detention at the airport. So we've received no kind of ministerial engagement of any kind. We've never spoken directly with anyone with sort of political decision-making capability, but the FCDO are very keen to sort of point out, and we acknowledge they are providing consular support. It's worth calling out what that is. That is weekly or every other week visit to Jim to make sure that he's being fed and watered. That is providing us with the phone number of an English-speaking lawyer in Iraq, and that's about it. So I mean, under the assumption that the Foreign Office looks after British citizens who run afoul of injustice abroad, we feel like they could certainly be doing more, and we are just urging the minister to just meet with us to discuss ways in which they are helping or ways in which they can help. We've not spoken to him verbally since before he was arrested. So, as I say, just coming up on 8 weeks now. But he gets online our time about 1 a.m. for sort of between 5 and 10 minutes. There's a flurry of messages, and he sort of picks up what we've been sending him throughout the day and replies a few times, and then disappears again. But as I said, the consular staff on the ground have been to visit him, and they assure us that he is being provided with food and water, and sort of his basic needs are being looked after. But it's 8 weeks in a temporary holding cell in an airport in Baghdad can't be comfortable, of course.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. So it's time now to discuss some of those climate issues of the day with Dr. Shihu and environmental consultant Richard Black. Thank you both for joining us this evening. So I guess the first big topic then, despite promises and pledges made at the UN climate conference in Glasgow, oil and gas companies are they're ruling the roost. Vast profits, as we've heard. And according to reporting in The Guardian this week, huge ongoing investments in projects that could see carbon emissions spiral out of control. Well, Richard, to you first. Are you hopeful then that COP27, when it comes around, will help drive that conversation to deter oil and gas companies from developing?
I think it may play a role, but the reality is there are a number of countries that are not, themselves convinced of the need to cut back on oil and gas production right now, and unsurprisingly, those countries include the ones that produce the most oil and gas. And I don't think that any international agreements really are going to make them do that. I think the real secret, the real way that the output of oil and gas companies is going to be undermined, the main way anyway, is basically by them being undercut on price. And if you look at what's happening in the energy industry, there is virtually no country on earth now where it's cheaper to build and operate a new gas-fired power station than it is to build and operate a new solar farm or a new wind farm. And in many cases, it's actually cheaper to build a new solar farm and operate it than it is to carry on with an existing power station that you have. Meanwhile, in the electric car field, which is the main way to undercut oil demand, sales are going bananas. We're talking about, each year the number of sales going up by maybe 40%, compounded. So they just keep going up. And in the end, this is just, I think, going to eat the market of oil and gas companies.
And CC, I guess there's a big drive, like Richard said, to invest in green energy, isn't there? And that's been pushed on, I suppose, by the war in Ukraine. Is there still room, though, for those big countries, the Middle East, the US, Australia, Canada, to understand where green energy should be?
Yes, I think so. Although I think what really matters is the content of the talks in these sort of climate talks and diplomacies, right? So the problem is there is a fundamental mismatch between the promises that are being made by the countries and the market incentives. So if we're going back to, oil and gas companies, at any company, they are driven by making money. So what we should be thinking about is whether these governments who are engaging in climate talks and diplomacy have the economic tools to change the behavior of these companies, because ultimately they're here to make a profit. And whatever tools we come up with have to alter that profit equation somehow to be effective in terms of reducing emissions.
So do you think, CC, a carbon tax would be important for businesses to sort of really get on board with green initiatives?
Yeah, so carbon taxes, carbon trading schemes have been in place and there have been some successes. What we need to do is to learn as fast as possible from, designing these lessons. And if they don't work, we really need to come up with some better tools. But ultimately, the market incentives have to be there for these companies to change their behavior.
Richard, I'd like your insight really into how these big oil and gas companies, they really view, climate summits, COP26. How do they view them? Are they running scared, or is it something they want to engage in?
I think just before I have a go at that, I think I agree with what Cici said. The reality is that there are many of the really big gas and oil companies that basically are governments. If you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at Qatar, as we're seeing Russia, China, this is not a question where these are external companies to be regulated by a government. They kind of are the government. So that sheds a different light on things. I think some of the companies look at the summits as something where they can basically try to sell their version of going green and their version of going to net zero. And that's actually shared by some governments as well. If you look at the plans put forward by Saudi Arabia, Australia, Russia, for example, for getting to net zero by mid-century, they all posit keeping fossil fuel extraction at current levels or even increasing it. So basically the summits can be a way to try and sell the carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen type route, where basically you carry on producing fossil fuels and magically you get to net zero.
OK, that leads us really nicely, onto our next big topic, which is targets, because we know that a record number of big polluting companies are committing to cutting CO2 emissions. And this is all from a UN-backed report. And then separately to that, they've cast doubt on whether oil companies can kind of deliver on those targets too. So, Richard, I'll start with you. How accountable are these companies when it comes to, big grand gestures and big targets that they do put out there?
Yes, most of the companies that are looked at here are the big publicly traded companies, and they're in all kinds of sectors, whether it be retail, manufacturing, all kinds of things. Ultimately, they're accountable to their shareholders. And of course, we've seen in recent years a number of times shareholders, passing resolutions that basically make the directors pay more attention to this stuff. A lot of the time, they'll be beholden to their customers because, particularly in Europe, there is a tradition of customers deciding who they will buy from based on the behaviour of that particular company. And then the other thing that's coming up on the rails is really regulation, and in many countries and jurisdictions, companies are increasingly having to disclose what their climate risk is, for example. So all these things are playing a role, but there's no sort of monolithic solution here. It's going to be incremental, it's going to be messy, and not all companies in all places are going to have to toe the line at the same time.
Cici, we do know that more than half of these companies setting targets are in the G7 rich nations, don't we? But India, China, Brazil, they're also in the mix. It's quite encouraging, that, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's really essential that companies are actually now making pledges because carbon production is, at the company level ultimately. Although I agree with Rich with everything that he said, I think I'm going to throw in a bit of a pessimistic thing in terms of a challenge here. I think companies don't necessarily know how to quantify emissions. And then I think that's one of the key problems right now, right? Even if you pledge, if you can't quantify and you don't know where your emissions are coming from, then how are you supposed to come up with the best practices? How are you supposed to prioritize? How are you supposed to evaluate, most importantly, of your progress? Oil and gas companies in particular, struggle with leaks. So there's a lot of challenges around these, pipelines running thousands of miles and nobody knows how much greenhouse gases is, leaked. So yeah, do companies have the capacity to measure emissions properly? That's one of the key challenges. But yeah, there is progress to be made.
It is about trust, it's about accountability. But one thing that is clear, Richard, Mark Carney, very briefly, is warning governments they can't derail the climate process with the war in Ukraine. Do you agree?
Yes, I do, but you have to say that for many governments that otherwise I think would be saying strong things about the climate talks at the moment, they're not, because their attention is focused on Ukraine. And it's not just the conflict as well. We've seen the energy prices around the world affected. We're going to see food prices around the world affected. So these are all visceral things. In Europe, we're actually looking, I think, at accelerating decarbonisation because people are now realising, politicians are now realising that, in the words of the German finance minister Christian Lindner, renewable energy is freedom energy.
And on that note, we'll leave it. Thank you, Cece and Richard. A pleasure talking to you today. Well, do stay with us. Coming up at 9, Sky political editor Beth Rigby will be speaking to Vladimir Chizov, the Russian ambassador to the European Union. That's coming up on Beth Rigby Interviews. Well, that's a big thank you for us for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.